Open the podcast bay door as hell.
Hello everyone, and welcome to episode 28 of Welcome to Geektown. I'm your host, Kurt Onstead. I've been a proud geek all my life, being into role-playing games, board games, sci-fi, fantasy, and especially superheroes and comics. And I want to help others join me in those pursuits. But I've found that sometimes people can get overwhelmed or feel left out because they don't already have what some consider the requisite knowledge to be considered a fan. And that's where Welcome to Geektown comes in. Here, you can ask your questions without feeling like a gatekeeper is calling you out for not yet being fully versed in every aspect of your new interest. Some big news to start the show. I've just launched a Patreon to allow you to support the show directly. For just $1 per month, you can help keep this show not just running, but improving. And you'll get special bonuses like extra audio content, mostly bloopers, and a monthly shoutout. Simply go to patreon.com/welcome to Geektown to sign up and get started right away. Thanks! The question this week was inspired by a discussion I had with Mike Mann and Josh Bald on one of their podcasts, The Face Pod, where they talk to various members of the Star Trek The Next Conversation podcast's Facebook group. That's right, it's a podcast about a Facebook group about a podcast about a 30-year-old show. Anyways, while chatting with them, the subject of the economy of the Federation in Star Trek came up, and I decided to reach out to Matt Dobra, who I spoke to about the economy of Wakanda back in episode 12. We ended up discussing this subject, and related topics, for so long that I decided to cut this up into multiple episodes. Even with splitting this up, this week's episode is going to be at least twice the normal length. So let's get into it now, shall we? Once again, we are talking with Matt Dobra. I'm going to pronounce that correctly this time. Matt is an economist and a professor. Can you give your little bit of credentials again, Matt?
Sure. I'm a professor of economics at Methodist University in Fayetteville, North Carolina. I have a PhD in economics, and I'm also a bit of a nerd.
Speaking of which, tell me a little bit about your Star Trek fandom. How long have you been into it? What's your favorite series? That sort of thing.
I would say that I've probably seen, if I had to just throw a number on it, 60 to 70% of all of the Star Trek stuff. I've watched Next Generation start to finish. I've watched DS9 start to finish. By the way, I think DS9 is the best.
No arguments here.
I've watched about half of Voyager, which is hit or miss. I watched about 6 episodes of Enterprise, and that was about what it was worth. And then I never made a concerted effort to watch the original series, but I've seen probably every episode at some point or another. I've been around long enough to do that. And then I also remember as a kid when I was 8 or 10, I loved watching the animated series when it was on, I want to say Nickelodeon or something like that.
Yeah, probably Nick at Night.
I've probably seen about half the movies. The recent ones I've seen all of. But I haven't been able to watch the newest series just because I try not to watch live TV. I'll get around to it, I'm sure.
I recommend doing so when you get a chance. So, before we get into the future economy of Star Trek, let's talk a little about the past. How was trade accomplished before money came into widespread use?
We bartered, and we were not terribly efficient at commerce before money. So if you don't have money, the only way to trade with other people is to trade one good that you have for a good that somebody else has. And the thing that money solves in that situation is what happens if you have a product I want, but I don't have a product you want. And we call this the mutual coincidence of wants. I need to want something you have, you need to want something I have. Money gets rid of that problem. And so it really streamlines the ability of any sort of market-based economy for people to be able to buy what they want because they don't have to go out and find some convoluted chain of, I'm going to trade my product for somebody else's product, and I'm going to trade that somewhere else so I can finally get the thing that Kurt wants so I can get a trade going on with him. So money solves that problem. Money makes an economy effective. And it has a bunch of other good attributes to it as well. But just streamlining trade is one of the fundamental benefits of it.
I don't know if you recall this, but there was a DS9 episode centered around Nog that dealt with this mutual coincidence of needs called Faith, Treachery, and the Great River, where Nog set up a giant trade of goods and services to get O'Brien a part that was needed to fix the Defiant. That one ended up working out, but there was a similar episode of MASH called For Want of a Boot that had a long series of trades fall apart due to one link in the chain breaking.
Right. And it's time consuming, it's difficult, and as you just pointed out, it can fall apart with one transaction not happening or one person changing their mind at some step along the way because this chain of trades is not instantaneous by any means.
So with bartering being so inefficient, how and when did some sort of money come to be used? It's obviously a very ancient practice, but do we know how it started exactly?
Absolutely, it's an ancient practice. I would imagine that what you would see in pre-modern societies is people would start to learn that there are certain goods that everybody's willing to take. So in this mutual coincidence of want situation, we might learn that everybody is willing to accept rice, for example, or everybody's willing to accept potatoes, or everybody's willing to accept shells. Like whatever it is, everybody's willing to accept that. And ultimately, people would wind up sort of gravitating towards those commodities that everybody is willing to accept. And what really makes some money useful is its ability to be fungible, meaning one is just as good as the next, for it to be divisible, for it to be durable. And so you probably are going to see a convergence on things like metal monies, gold, silver, things like that. I believe, this is me guessing a little bit, I believe that minting of coins was sort of 500, 600, 700 BC. Paper money would have came around maybe a couple thousand years after that. And governments have been in and out of the business of the printing of money for a very long time. You don't need a government to make money start, but it's often in the business of doing it. So there's some really interesting economic research that looks at, for example, there was a great paper written about the economics of a POW camp, and the name of the author escapes me, but a prisoner of war camp, I want to say it was in World War II, where they were able to sort of find a commodity that was used as money. In prisons, there's no money, but up until very recently, cigarettes were used as money, as a de facto, medium of exchange. I saw an NPR piece, I want to say about a year ago, that found that ramen noodle packets were emerging as a new form of money in prisons because they are easily divisible and everybody wants them.
Well, that makes sense. Everyone needs to eat, and ramen is fairly portable and lasts a while, so it's useful in that capacity. Now, let's get into Star Trek's economy. One of the famous quotes about the Federation's economy comes from Star Trek IV in the conversation between Jillian and Captain Kirk, when we hear,
"Don't tell me they don't use money in the 23rd century.
Well, we don't.
When I read discussions of this subject, one thing I see a lot is that the Federation is a post-scarcity society. As an economist, how do you define that?
Okay, that's not a simple question. So when an economist uses the term scarcity, what they typically mean is there is enough of all commodities that everybody can have as much as they want, period. Like whatever you want, you can have it. The term post-scarcity is really tied in with Marxist ideology. And the idea of the Marxist ideology with regard to post-scarcity is that when we live in a world of post-scarcity, when anybody can have what they want when they want it, that somehow the world will evolve, that the nature of humanity will change, and that's what generates, Marxist utopias or socialist utopias or whatever. So it really should imply a world in which there's enough of everything that everybody can have whatever they want. There should never be a shortage of anything. That, I think, is what they're trying to accomplish with that, but I don't buy it.
So, the way they've supposedly achieved post-scarcity is through the replicator, which can make pretty much anything that's needed. Ignoring the physics question of whether or not the replicator can exist, if it did, would that create a post-scarcity society then?
In a sense, what they're really doing is using energy to convert matter into whatever form they want that matter to take. Ultimately, the item that is scarce in this case would be energy. And do they have an unlimited amount of energy that they have to deal with? How many, think about Voyager. So when they're lost in the Delta Quadrant, they need to ration energy. They're rationing replicator use. They're rationing, holodeck time. That act of rationing implies that there is no lack of scarcity. They don't live in a post-scarcity society. And so caught up in this notion of post-scarcity is the idea that everybody can have all that they want anytime that they want it. But it really doesn't appear that the world of Star Trek is that. It appears that rather than everybody can have whatever they want whenever they want, they're really creating a different sort of world. And you might call it a post-satiation society, meaning everybody has as much as they need, or maybe one of a post-greed society where people have stopped wanting more stuff. But what they haven't done is created, in my mind, a true post-scarcity society. They've moved the bar. They've called it post-scarcity. They've implied post-scarcity, but they're really talking about transforming what it is that people want and simply saying somehow people want less stuff today than they did 200, 400, 500 years in the past. So what they're living in is not post-scarcity. They're living in something a little bit different, a post-need society. And they've imagined a world in which people feel that they don't want more than they need, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that does. Now, there are a few exceptions to that rule, even within the Federation itself. Characters like Harry Mudd in the original series and now Discovery, and someone like Vash in Next Gen and DS9, who are Federation citizens, but still act in a very capitalist way, and are wanting to sell items like androids for Harry Mudd or antiquities for Vash, in order to acquire more than anyone really needs.
Right. Well, Vash is one of my favorite characters, for what it's worth. So certainly it seems like there's a lot of stuff going on in this Star Trek world that looks a lot like capitalism, even though they're not really calling it that. So you could think about Vosh, and basically she's what is she? She's like Space Lara Croft, right?
Yeah.
Like she's out there finding stuff and selling it and cool. At the same time, Picard has a brother who owns a vineyard in France. And at the same time, Cisco has a father who owns a restaurant in New Orleans. So how are these people owning stuff? Like what are they doing in these places of business? Are we To believe that, for example, Cisco's father is giving away free food to anybody who shows up and wants Cajun food on a given day? Maybe. And even if that is the case, what is going to keep people pushing for more? And you get back to, for example, I think it was Picard's speech in the last episode of season 1, The Neutral Zone was the episode, where he talks about people don't do things for material wealth or material gain. They do it for self-improvement. Jake says something very similar when he sells a book. And he didn't actually sell it for anything, and Nog makes fun of him for having a society that gave up on money years and years ago. And so, again, this goes back to, in order for this world to make sense, you need to transform not the economy, but how people believe that they need to be treated within the economy. And so there really is some Marxist undertones to what they're trying to tell with their story. So if you'll allow me a quick digression on a little bit of Marx. I'm not the biggest fan, but I think it's worth understanding some of his ideas.
Sure.
So Marx thinks about a world in which there is no human nature. Rather, human nature is formed by the society in which we live, and the society, the culture, the norms, religion, and the laws, and all of that derive from, that's all called superstructure, and that derives from what he calls the base, and the base is simply who owns the means of production. And so the idea is that you can mold the nature of man, and you can make man not greedy, and you can make man really whatever you want him to be by changing the way that you determine who makes what and who gets what. And this is sort of the opposite of one of my favorite of the Ferengi rules of acquisition, the 10th rule of acquisition, which is that greed is eternal. Right. So the Ferengi notion is that people, or Ferengi or whatever, by their very nature have some element of greed. That is, our humanity, right, is driven by our want, which is very different from that Marxist utopia version. If you want a world that looks like what the Star Trek universe economy is supposed to look like, you really need that transformation of man into only wanting what is deemed needed for him, or only wanting the bare necessities, leaving enough for everybody to go around. You need the transformation of man into caring more about the collective than about the individual. You need the transformation of man to care more about everyone around him than himself. So, to leave, stuff out there for everybody else, to only take the resources that they need.
So it sounds like you think that this society is completely impossible, even if we had the technology like the replicator and controlled matter-antimatter reactions to provide nearly limitless energy. What do you think is preventing that?
So when people would ask me what I thought about socialism, is it possible? My answer would be, why don't we revisit this question once somebody's invented a replicator like in Star Trek? Because to me, that was always sort of the benchmark for, can we get enough stuff to make everybody happy most of the time? But at the same time, there are still many elements that there definitely a scarcity of. So if you remember, I want to think it's it was one of the cliffhanger episodes of The Next Generation when they encounter the Borg and the Borg wipes out their fleet.
Best of both worlds.
And they're having trouble finding enough ships to fight back against the Borg. That is sort of indicative of they're definitely rationing stuff. They don't, why don't they have a replicator out there just making miles upon miles of ships for, if one gets scratched, let's get a new one. It's cool. Again, I don't think that they really have the same, the level of economic resources that we think they might.
It's interesting that you say there would be a dark underpinning to this society. Star Trek's often held up as an example of utopian fiction, but it sounds like you disagree. So, what kind of things would make that society not a utopia?
I don't think it would. And I think that there's probably a lot of ugly stuff under the hood of that society. So, for one, I think you're going to see a relatively severe limitation on individual liberties. And that's something that I view as being part of a utopian society. So, I'm not sure if you're familiar with it's a two-parter Time's Arrow in The Next Generation. They wind up going back to 1880-ish in San Francisco, and they run into Mark Twain, and then Mark Twain somehow magically appears on the ship. And so Deanna Troi is walking around with Mark Twain on the ship, and Mark Twain is really upset because they're not going to let him smoke a cigar on the ship. And so Mark Twain says, "What good is your world if you can't smoke a cigar?" And Deanna Troi says, "Well, in exchange for you not smoking the cigar, we have cured cancer and we have cured poverty and all of these things." And the way they're framing that, the way they're discussing this idea is, you know what, people of in the real world, we're just going to make you give up small things like smoking in order to have an exchange for a world of endless bounty. But somehow I don't think it's going to be just give up the small things, because as we look at other societies around the world today that are saying we're going to limit what you're allowed to do in order to better society as a whole, you might get stuff that's a little bit more heavy-handed than that. I also suspect that they're not a terribly democratic place to be. Maybe I'm wrong. I could very well be wrong. But it certainly seems like the government has very strong control over society. And again, this goes back to the idea of, can you transform man to only want what you tell him that he wants? And so, I mean, I think I'm sort of, maybe I'm talking in circles, but maybe I think it all boils back down to, you need to change human nature, and then all of this stuff is possible. But if you change human nature, maybe this is a utopia. Because if you change human nature to not want anything that they're not allowed to want by some dictate from the top, then yeah, world's great. Everybody has plenty of stuff. I'm not sure I would do too well there, though. I'd get the Mark Twain treatment.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because in Star Trek, we mostly follow the members of Starfleet, which, while they kind of play with whether or not it is military, it definitely has militaristic aspects to it.
That's a fair point. I mean, we're not seeing normal life on Earth.
We see a little bit of it here and there with, like, Captain Sisko's father with his Cajun restaurant, and other small examples like that. It'd be interesting to see a show that focuses on the civilians and see how much freedom and democracy and capitalism is actually involved in this society.
Basically, I mean, I feel when I watch the shows that the way they portray other races is as caricatures or as symbolic of various isms or various societies. So, if you look at the Cardassians, they're very much, in my mind, supposed to represent like the behind the Iron Curtain Eastern Europe of the 50s through the 90s, right? Like, that's just who they're supposed to be. If you look at the Ferengi, I think they're supposed to be a humorous send-up of American capitalism. That's their role in the shows, is to provide the way to make a commentary on American capitalism by making the Ferengi as laughable and greedy and horrific as they possibly can. So I do think we see some elements of what normal life is like in a way, but again, it's through the eyes of the Federation, and in particular through the eyes of the Federation military, the Federation Navy, I guess it would be. But, what if we had a whole season through the eyes of the Borg? I'd love to see that. If you want to see a true communist society at work, that's what you've got.
Yeah, you're right. The different races are definitely exaggerated but recognizable representations of different philosophies and cultures from today's society. The Ferengi with capitalism, the Borg with pure communism, and so on. But coming back to the Federation itself, I'd like to hope that if we found a way to meet and exceed the entire population's needs, that we could move to a society like one promised in Star Trek, where the world has moved beyond greed.
I mean, you can hope that.
Okay.
So, I mean, you probably haven't. Have you ever heard of a term called the hedonic treadmill?
No, but knowing both of those words, I'm getting an idea of what it is, but go ahead and go into details.
So the hedonic treadmill is sort of a thought experiment, or it's not even an experiment. It's it's a notion. It's an idea. Hedonic meaning happiness, and treadmill, well, we all kind of know what a treadmill is. And the idea is that when you're on the treadmill, what is your happiness level? Let's throw a number on it. Let's say that you're 5 happy. That doesn't make any sense, but let's just say it makes sense, right? So you're 5 happy. And then, I don't know, some tragedy befalls you, right? A satellite hits your car. Like, that sucks. So your happiness level goes down to a 3. You're unhappy, but quickly over time, not quickly necessarily, but you get adjusted to that level of happiness of not having a car, and you return to a 5. The same thing is true if you, say, win the lottery. Let's say you buy a scratch-off ticket and you get $100,000. So immediately you're happy, right? That makes you happy. But relatively soonly, you adjust to that level of income and you return back to the level of happiness that you were at before. And you adjust to that higher level of income. And you continue to want more than what you already have. So I think it's just baked into human nature that there's always a little bit more that you'd think would make you happier. Maybe you're more enlightened than I am, though. I'm willing to admit that.
Well, I don't know if I would necessarily go there, but I try to live according to the ideals of Star Trek when I can. It's been a show that has been a big influence on my life personally. And so maybe that's just been a bigger influence on me than it has on others.
Well, I think there's lots of things that are worthy of influencing you in Star Trek. The value of fair play, the value of earning your keep, the value of being a team player, the value of pursuing right over wrong. There's a lot of good virtues that are inherent in the Star Trek universe that I absolutely think that we should all try to strive for. Whether or not their economy is realistic, that's a different question altogether. I don't think that you need to have a fully Star Trek'd out economy in order to be able to see the virtue in helping out others who are in need, in order to view the virtue of helping your fellow man or being a team player. These are all things that I would say cross all sorts of different types of economic situations.
So I think that's a good place to end part 1 of this discussion. We changed subjects pretty drastically at that point, although things will loop back around eventually. But you'll get to hear that in 2 weeks' time with the next episode. While you're waiting, let me know what you think of the show, or ask a question that you want answered in a future episode. You can do that by sending an email to me at welcometogeektown@gmail.com, or leave a comment directly on the show notes at www.welcome2, the number 2 in this case, geektown.com. Other contact options include facebook.com/welcometogeektown or Twitter @geektownpodcast. In the meantime, don't forget to subscribe and give me a 5-star review over on iTunes to join the Geektown City Council, to help other people find the show so we can all tell them, welcome to Geektown, population, us. Welcome to Geektown is written, narrated, edited, and produced by me, Kurt Onstead. Theme music is by Aaron Levitz, logo art by Archie Santana. All other sound clips are the copyrighted material of their respective owners, and no infringement is intended, falling under fair use.